Welcome to Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities presentation on the Provider Rule Update, which is OAC Rule 3304-2-53, outlining qualifications and standards for service providers and vendors. Thank you so much for joining us today to listen and learn about recent updates to the Provider Rule. This is Jay Burns with the Provider and Contract Management Unit. Today, you'll also be hearing from Rana Woods, also from the Provider and Contract Management Unit, as well as Lisa Charlton, External Audit Supervisor with the Division of Fiscal Management and the Monitoring and Compliance Unit. Today, we'll be discussing why we've had this recent rule update, which includes just standardization of safety requirements, including background check and transportation requirements, as well as a consolidation of information that existed in other areas, such as the VR provider manual. So we'll be going over all of these changes today, as well as detailing information about provider applicants, which is new provider organizations seeking to be VR providers with opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities, as well as approved providers, current providers of services for OOD. We'll be talking about those background check requirements in more detail, as well as the transportation requirements for provider staff transporting individuals or participants. We'll also be going over ethics, health, safety, and confidential personal information. We'll also be discussing provider management and support. Thanks so much for your time today. We really appreciate all of the services our providers deliver to individuals with disabilities across Ohio. It's so important and integral for them to reach their employment and independence outcomes. So today we'll be talking to providers, stakeholders, and OOD staff of all these recent changes, understanding the expectations of health, safety, and confidential personal information requirements, understanding the new background check requirement, and understanding the provider management and support process. In other words, how OOD works with the providers to ensure quality services. I'm going to turn it over to Rana Woods now.
Hi, everybody. So some of you may be wondering, why was this rule even changed? In this slide, I have a picture of an emoji looking confused. OOD updated this rule to set overall standards for safety, health, ethics, CPI, transportation, and background check requirements for individuals with disabilities. This rule was changed to also consolidate information found elsewhere, such as the VR provider manual. This rule will now ensure trust with the public, including family members, advocates, and other members of an individual's team. And the language of this rule is now in alignment with other government agencies in Ohio that provide public service. This slide shows a quick overview of the changes. Please remember everything remains the same in the rule, and that OOD has added and defined requirements of the standards that were mentioned previously. Before, the rule defined and outlined accreditation and qualification requirements. Now, in addition to that, the rule also defines requirements of provider applicants and approved providers. Previously, the rule defined specific credentialing requirements for certain services. In other words, work incentives planning, supported employment, pre-employment transition services. Again, that is still included in the rule, along with provider staff qualifications and the requirement of background checks, along with ethics, safety, and protection of CPI. And finally, the rule previously defined that VR service providers must maintain and renew certification or accreditation and submit to OOD. That remains the same, along with the rule defining the process and expectations for provider support and management. When looking at provider applicants and approved providers, the accreditation and certification requirements remain the same. The updated rule now defines the process for provider applicants to submit an application and documentation through the Provider Management Program, or PMP. We now have requirements for approved providers, for example, complying with OOD's VR provider manual. The rule now defines the requirements for subcontracting. OOD may require providers to complete OOD provider training, and finally, the provider acknowledgement shall be completed in the Provider Management Program, or PMP, by October 1st of each federal fiscal year. The provider acknowledgement may be submitted up to 60 days prior to the due date of October 1st. We now have new language in the rule that includes that OD has now defined that unpaid interns and volunteer staff are not considered provider staff. Therefore, unpaid interns and volunteers cannot invoice for services provided to OOD participants. Another change is that provider staff must be at least 18 years old and hold a high school diploma or high school equivalence diploma. Moving on to background checks. This is a new requirement for OOD providers and will consist of database checks and the FBI and BCI check. For the database checks, providers will need to perform database checks on provider staff. These databases include the System for Award Management, Office of the Inspector General, Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities Online Abuser Registry, Ohio Medicaid Provider Exclusion and Suspension List, Ohio Attorney General's Sex Offender Search, Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction Offender Search, and the Ohio Department of Health Nurse Aid Registry. Please keep in mind that all 7 of these database searches are free. For the FBI and BCI criminal records check, please keep in mind the following information. A BCI check is required if the person has continuously lived in Ohio for at least 5 years. An FBI and BCI check is required if a person has lived in Ohio less than 5 years, or if convicted of a crime in another state or of a federal offense. Please refer to Rule 3304-2-53, Section 10 for the completed list of exclusions. Provisional hiring. OD will allow provisional or conditional hiring for up to 60 days pending receipt of the provider staff's criminal records results, as long as the following occurs. The required attestation is signed. The employee the provider is waiting for the background check on has continuously lived in Ohio for at least 5 years, so a BCI check is required in this circumstance. And the provisional hire cannot serve OD participants beyond the 60 days, or if the employee's criminal records check lists a disqualifying offense. Additional information regarding background checks include providers are required to maintain written and electronic background checks for all provider staff who work with OOD participants. These checks are to be done every 5 years. OOD will allow electronic background check monitoring systems if they are used continuously. An example would be Ohio's RAPBAC or IRAP system. It's also important to remember to keep these written records on file. OOD can request from providers documentation for verification on background check completion within 24 hours if this is requested. Audit for background checks. OOD's Monitoring and Compliance Unit, or MCU, will be adding background check reviews as part of the fiscal and monitoring process that is currently in place for approved providers. If requested by MCU, providers shall produce requested documentation or background check information within 5 business days or at a later date, if agreed to in writing by MCU. Transportation. If provider staff are transporting OD participants, new requirements include that provider staff must be at least 18 years old, have 2 years of driving experience, must hold a valid Ohio driver's license, and be covered by valid liability insurance. Providers must also look at the provider staff's driving record from the Ohio BMV. For provider staff are prohibited from transporting OOD participants if the Ohio BMV reports shows 6 or more points on a license or a suspended or revoked driver's license. When looking at ethics, we require providers to adhere to the ethical code of conduct for any licensure, certifications, or accreditation credentials. For insurance, we require the provider to hold appropriate insurance for any safety issues which may occur. Please refer to Rule 3304-2-53, Section I for required coverage minimum. When looking at safety, it is important to remember for all providers that safety is a must. Medical emergencies and significant incidences should align with OOD's Significant Incident Report Form or SIRF process. The provider must also have policies and procedures in regards to equal employment opportunity or EEO complaints and violations, policies and procedures around sexual harassment, and policies and procedures for appropriate professional boundaries. Significant Incident Report Form or SIRF form. The SIRF form is required for all incidents and issues which affect and or pose a threat to the safety, health, and or welfare of individuals receiving services from OOD. Examples of a SIRF form include injuries requiring medical treatment, specific threats of harm to self or others, suspected abuse or neglect, suspected illegal activity, any other non-routine incident that may cause public interest or concern. Upon learning of the significant incident, providers shall first ensure the safety and health of the individual. Examples include calling 911, providing first aid, calling law enforcement. Providers will then immediately contact the assigned VR counselor or VR coordinator via telephone. Please remember, if you cannot reach the counselor or coordinator, you may leave a voicemail message, but then you must also begin calling other individuals at OOD to speak to a live person. Within 24 hours of the incident, the provider shall complete the SIRF form and submit via secure email, in other words, Zixmail, to the assigned VR counselor or VR coordinator and copy OOD's provider and contract management unit or PCMU at the following email address: pcmu@ood.ohio.gov. Reporting after hours. If the incident or issue occurs during non-business hours, examples would be evening, weekend, and holidays, and the incident does not involve filing a local county board of developmental disabilities major unusual incident or MUI report, nor does it involve contacting law enforcement. The provider is to leave a voicemail message with the VR counselor or VR contractor and follow up with a telephone call the first thing the next morning of the business day. If the incident or issue occurs during non-business hours, again, we're looking at evenings, weekends, and holidays, and does involve filing a local county board of developmental disabilities MUI report or contacting law enforcement, providers must contact an OOD area manager, OOD assistant deputy director, or OOD deputy director immediately after the individual's safety, health, and or welfare is verified. More information can be found on the Reporting Significance Incident page that can be accessed at the bottom of the Information for Providers page on OOD's main website. Conflicts of interest. This exists if the private interests of the provider or staff interfere with the public's interest in which the staff person is required to serve in the exercise of the provider's authority and duties in the provider's position of employment. Provider staff cannot provide a service to or access any case information for program participants with whom they may have a potential conflict of interest. Please remember, provider staff cannot provide services to immediate family members, and if providers have any questions about a potential conflict of interest, please email PCMU for guidance. Again, our email address is pcmu@ood.ohio.gov. Confidential personal information or CPI. When you think of CPI, hopefully the following comes to mind: an individual's full name, address, social security number, medical and disability history, perhaps a copy of a driver's license or state ID. These are all examples of CPI. Providers must develop and follow policies and procedures for storing information, ensuring electronic information is in a secure and an encrypted format on a computer, tablet, or other mobile device, ensuring data that is transported is not visible from the exterior of the vehicle. It is not stored overnight in a vehicle, making sure access is restricted if a conflict of interest occurs, and preventing electronic communications from being sent to unintended recipients. If a CPI breach occurs, it must be reported to OOD within 24 hours, and OOD will meet with the provider to discuss specific information regarding the incident and resolution and notification to the affected participants. It is important to remember ID theft protection to affected participants may be required. I am now going to turn the presentation over to Lisa in the Monitoring and Compliance Unit.
Thank you, Rana. Hello, my name is Lisa Charlton. I'm the External Audit Supervisor in the Monitoring and Compliance Unit, otherwise known as MCU. Thank you for having me today. I wanted to talk to you about MCU's role in monitoring providers, what you can expect when we engage you in a review, and what it all means. To start, OOD may perform reviews of providers for various reasons, including, but not limited to, specific service delivery issues, risk-based reviews, fiscal integrity, and routine program evaluation and monitoring. Reviews conducted by my unit include service quality, reporting accuracy, fiscal integrity, and/or other service dimensions. What to expect from MCU. MCU routinely performs proactive reviews of providers, but will also conduct reviews as requested by OOD management. For example, a provider review for summer use services. Typically, the provider will receive an email from MCU that they have been selected for a review. The email may contain information such as the scope of the review, when the review will start, and MCU contact information. The scope statement lets you know what we plan to review. For example, MCU plans to conduct a provider review of job development invoices and reports paid from April 1st to June 30th. In addition, at the start of the review, MCU may request additional information from the provider if necessary. Upon receipt of all pertinent information, MCU will begin testing. Once the testing is complete, MCU will draft and issue the preliminary report to the provider via email. The provider will have 10 calendar days from receipt of the preliminary report to submit an objection if they are not in agreement with the report. The request must be in writing and submitted to MCU. If the provider submits an objection to the preliminary report, MCU will respond to the provider in writing, acknowledging receipt of the objection, and notify the provider they have 30 days from receipt of the preliminary report to submit additional information. So there is no confusion, the response will clearly indicate the date the 30-day deadline expires to submit additional information. MCU will review the additional information and/or supporting documentation and indicate whether each observation and/or finding is mitigated. Once testing is complete, MCU will draft and issue the final report to the provider via email. Providers may contact MCU at any time during the review process if there are any questions or concerns. So let's talk about the results of a provider review and what it all means. MCU reviews may or may not result in observations and/or findings. No observations or findings means no errors were identified during the review. Please keep in mind we are only referring to the scope of the review. For example, provider review of job development invoices and reports paid from April 1st to June 30th. MCU is not referring to all invoices and reports completed by the provider, only what was reviewed in the scope of the review. As for observations and findings, observations are minor, easily corrected errors that are expected to be addressed. Findings are pervasive, systemic, ongoing, or egregious errors that must be addressed. Findings may or may not include question costs. In addition to observations and findings, MCU reviews could potentially result in a corrective action plan and/or cost recovery. A corrective action plan is a formal plan designed to correct findings. Cost recovery are question costs identified during the review and not mitigated by the provider. MCU will document findings with question costs in the preliminary report. If the provider is not in agreement with the findings, you may file an objection to the preliminary report as previously described and submit additional information for consideration that may mitigate some or all of the question costs. What happens next? If MCU recommends a corrective action plan, at the conclusion of the review, the provider will work with PCMU regarding next steps. If MCU recommends cost recovery at the conclusion of the review, the provider will receive a notice of invoiced question costs along with the final report. The provider will have 45 calendar days to submit the amount owed to OOD. The invoice will clearly indicate the date the payment is due. If the amount owed OOD is not paid within 45 days, the account will be submitted to the Ohio Attorney General for collection pursuant to Section 131.02 of the Ohio Revised Code. MCU will attempt to contact the provider for payment status prior to submitting the account to the Ohio Attorney General. What happens after MCU's review has concluded? In addition to MCU's observations, findings, caps, and cost recovery, OOD may implement one or more of the following when deficits are identified: alternate billing process, suspension of specific service, or suspension of all services. Providers with repeated caps without resolving the deficits may lose their OOD approved provider status. And lastly, if OOD elects to go with any of these processes, the provider will be notified in writing.
Thanks, Lisa. We hope you have found this training to be helpful, and I know a lot of information has been presented. But to review what we have learned, this rule now requires providers to have written policies and procedures in place for health, safety, and CPI. The rule now requires criminal background checks for provider staff, and providers must keep this information on file. The rule now defines the onboarding process for provider applicants through the Provider Management Program. New providers will submit the criminal background check information through the Provider Management Program, or PMP, as well. Provider acknowledgements are now due by October 1st of each year. The rule defines specific requirements for subcontracting and transportation. OOD's intervention strategies are now in the rule, along with training if required. I am now going to show you how to find OAC Rule 3304-2-53 on OOD's website. Please start by going to our main webpage, www.ood.ohio.gov. You will click on the Information for Providers tab. That will then take you to our main webpage. You will click on the Provider News tab. You will have to scroll down to the Provider Rule Update. When you click on the Provider Rule Update tab, you will get to the Provider Rule Update message. You will see the Rule 3304-2-53 Qualifications and Standards for Provider Services and Vendors link. When you click on the link, it will open up to a new tab on a web page that is the actual rule from the Ohio Revised Code webpage. We want to take a moment to thank all of our providers for your continued partnership and collaboration with OOD, and for continuing to offer and provide services to our OOD participants. And finally, if you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to contact us in our general mailbox. Again, that is pcmu@ood.ohio.gov. And you can also reach out to any of your regional program specialists. For the Northeast area, that's myself, Ronna Woods. We have Melanie Suckler, who is the rehab program specialist in the East Central area. We also have Jennifer Pollard, the rehabilitation program specialist in the Southeast area, and currently Jennifer is providing coverage for the Northwest area as well. Ginger Scaife, the rehab program specialist in the Southwest area. And we also have Jay Burns, the vocational rehabilitation supervisor out of Central Office. We thank you for watching this training today, and we hope you have a great day.